And as we pause to reflect on victory in Europe 80 years ago, we will go back in history to the week the war was won, in May 1945.
We take you behind the scenes at Westminster Abbey, meeting some of those who will play a special role on an historic day. Climbing on the statue of Winston Churchill in Parliament Square will soon be against the law. The government is adding the 12-foot bronze figure to a list of monuments that will be illegal to climb. Offenders could face up to 3 months in prison and a £1,000 fine.
Russia has held the final rehearsals in Moscow's Red Square ahead of Friday's Victory Day commemorations that will mark 80 years since the defeat of Nazi Germany. 27 million people from the Soviet Union were killed in the Second World War. President Putin is trying to convince the public there's no difference between the war he began in Ukraine and the struggle the country waged against Adolf Hitler. In the past hour, the Chinese President Xi Jinping has arrived in the country as one of Vladimir Putin's invited guests. Our Russia editor, Steve Rosenberg, sent this report from Moscow.
80 miles from Moscow, they're rerunning the battle for Berlin, 80 years after the defeat of Nazi Germany. What Russians call the Great Victory. Katya's grandfather was killed fighting Germany. Her son is fighting in Russia's war on Ukraine. He volunteered. I tried to talk him out of it, Katya says, but he never listens. I am my own Tsar, he said. I replied, go fight then if you're a Tsar. He went with a friend. His friend was killed. Comrades in arms, a Red Army hero from World War II, and a Russian soldier fighting Ukraine, and Russia's recent war dead. An attempt to link wars, past and present.
In 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and at an enormous human cost, 27 million lives, the USSR defeated Nazi Germany. But in 2022, it was Russia that invaded Ukraine. These two wars are very different, but the authorities here portray one as the continuation of the other, as if to make Russians believe that they are always under threat and always on the right side of history.
And always unbeatable. Ahead of the World War II anniversary, the word victory is everywhere. In shop windows and on street sweepers. Underground on trains. Tattooed onto rockets and blasted into space. Russia going out of its way to show the national idea now is victory. Perhaps that's why for newborn babies in Siberia, current fashion is more military than mother care. But 98-year-old Fyodor Melnikov knows well the cost of victory. His brother was killed fighting the Nazis. War is a terrible thing, Fyodor says. People should be left alone to work and to live out their lives in peace. Final rehearsals for the Red Square parade. Victory eludes Moscow in Ukraine, but the victory of 1945 will be lauded and used to show that Russia is a great power. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Moscow.
It is almost 80 years to the day that Winston Churchill announced to the nation that the war in Europe was over. VE Day marked the end of nearly 6 years of war that had destroyed homes, families, cities and cost millions of lives. The news of Germany's surrender when it finally came was not altogether surprising. Berlin was already in ruins and many in Britain were on standby to begin the celebration. Here's the historian James Holland on how the events unfolded around May 8th, 1945.
This was the British people's finest day. VE Day, the end of the German war.
Up and down the country, people spent the 8th of May 1945 celebrating.
Here at Buckingham Palace, the King and Queen and the Prime Minister Winston Churchill were cheered by vast crowds when they appeared on the famous balcony.
London was partying. In cities, towns and villages, There were street parties and plenty of carousing after 5.5 long years of war.
The end came in something of a rush. By the beginning of May 1945, Germany lay in ruins and large numbers of enemy forces began surrendering.
And unconditionally, as the Allies had insisted.
The people sensed that the hour of complete German defeat in Italy was at hand.
First in Italy,
Defeat is written in every ruin of battered Berlin.
then to the Soviet Red Army in Berlin on the 2nd of May,
In an old and tattered tent.
to British Field Marshal Montgomery on the 5th of May, and then to the US 6th Army Group in Bavaria that same day.
At 2:41 on the morning of Monday, the 7th of May, German commanders surrendered all remaining forces to General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander in the West.
The German delegation, headed by General
The signing took place at his headquarters in the French city of Reims. Churchill prepared to announce a surrender that afternoon. But Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, refused to agree to any announcement until the Germans had formally signed a surrender to the Red Army in Berlin. This, he announced, would take place at 1 minute past midnight on the 9th of May, Berlin time.
But there was another twist, because on the afternoon of the 7th of May, German radio broadcast details of the surrender. The cat was out of the bag.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight.
Churchill now decided to ignore Stalin and persuaded President Truman that the 8th of May should be considered Victory in Europe Day.
Finally, the German surrender was then completed at 43 minutes past midnight on the 9th of May.
Field Marshal Keitel, Chief of the German High Command.
Which is why the Russians still celebrate victory that day rather than on the 8th.
Our dear Channel Islands, as Mr. Churchill called them, are free again.
And it was also on the 9th of May that the Channel Islands were finally liberated too. The crowds filled the streets, but not everyone was celebrating. Not the vanquished, not the millions of displaced, nor many who had lost family and friends, and nor those in the Far East and the Pacific still fighting the Japanese. They would have to wait a further 3 months for the most cataclysmic conflict in the history of the world to be finally over.